Good evening. I'd like to thank Garage Museum for this invitation for organizing this event. It is an honor to be invited to this Avant-Garde institution and to participate in its lecture series. Today is a particular important moment for speaking about VKhUTEMAS and its pedagogy, as we are celebrating the centennial of the school, and there are a number of commemorative events that are happening this fall. So I'd like to start by introducing VKhUTEMAS through, in fact, one of its major historical emissions. In his canonical chart mapping the development of modern art, MoMA's founding director, Alfred Barr, pictured here, positioned the Bauhaus as the primary outcome of a whole range of avant-garde movements: Cubism, Futurism, Textile, including, of course, the two Russian ones, Constructivism and Suprematism. Barr could not have been more impressed by what he saw in Russia, a place that he visited for almost 2 months in 1927, 1928, and the winter. There is no place where talent of an artistic or literary sort is so carefully nurtured as in Moscow. We'd rather be here than any place on earth, he writes in his diary. And yet he chose not to include the other school, VKhUTEMAS, which he reportedly visited 3 times during his visit to Moscow, as he described in his diary. In his 1936 exhibit, Barr shown works of Tatlin, Rodchenko, Lysitsky, and other avant-garde artists that he met in 1927, all of whom were professors and students at the Moscow school, but never mentioned their affiliation, something that would have been impossible to imagine if they were Bauhaus faculty instead. In fact, the works of the Bauhaus faculty were framed as its own board, along with several other objects, including the Kandinsky chair by Breuer and a poster by Herbert Bayer celebrating Kandinsky himself, who turned 60 at the time of the MoMA show. Interestingly enough, Barr even included the project of a Lysitsky here, abstract cabinet, that I have a cutout of, as part of the Bauhaus display, which is quite ironic given that Lysitsky was not a faculty at the Bauhaus and actually taught at VKhUTEMAS for a number of years from 1925 on and briefly in 1920. And yet, despite this historical omission, and the current state of knowledge, or lack thereof, VKhUTEMAS was by no means unknown at the time of its existence. One of the events that put the school on the map and on the international stage was the 1925 Art Deco Exhibition in Paris, where the school received the grand prize for its student work, a testament to a pedagogy that was then barely 5 years old. And here you can see some of the models that were exhibited by produced by the faculty of the school. Of course, the project that drew most attention at the exhibition were the pavilion by Konstantin Melnikov, who was a professor at VKhUTEMAS, and the Workers' Club interior project by Alexander Rodchenko, who also was a faculty at the school. While VKhUTEMAS is routinely mentioned in the discussions on the Soviet avant-garde, I would argue that its seminal role within the larger cultural landscape of modernism has not been properly investigated as of yet. Meanwhile, even a cursory look at the period publications in both the Soviet Union and the West, such as ABC, of course, the catalog for the exhibit, the Contemporary Architecture magazine in Russia, and many, many others, revealed that the school's contribution far exceeded the scope of its pedagogical achievements. VKhUTEMAS projects were published, of course, in the catalog of the exhibition designed by Rodchenko. And here, one of the very interesting things about the school is the combination of, or at least the way it was featured in this catalog, is the combination of the VKhUTEMAS projects right next to the decorative arts that were placed on the same page. The book by Lysitsky, who features a number of student and faculty projects, Here is one example. Of course, the seminal book by Adolf Bennis, The Modern Functional Building, also features a project from the space course in Ladovsky's studio. And perhaps importantly, one of the key architects of the modern era, Le Corbusier, here talks about VKhUTEMAS, describes the school in his journal as an extraordinary demonstration of the modern credo. Here, a new world is being rebuilt out of a mystique which gives rise to a pure technique. And Le Corbusier also visited VKhUTEMAS a number of times and met with its numerous faculty. So what is the reason for this historical overlook of the school that is often referred to as the Soviet Bauhaus? This is one of the questions that I plan to address in this lecture. And one way I'd like to do this is by situating VKhUTEMAS within Soviet revolutionary culture as well as within a large international context, and define the school's seminal role in building a collective industrialized society. I will also go over the comparison between the Soviet Bauhaus and the real Bauhaus. So the revolution in art preceded the revolutionary events on the political front. Left Russian artists embraced the change, in effect turning the street into its canvas, as poet Vladimir Mayakovsky famously calls on the revolutionary crowds to use the street as paintbrushes and squares as palettes in his wonderful poem. One of the first reforms introduced by the Bolshevik government, along with the abolition of private property and the nationalization of land, was a radical educational reform, and in particular the reform of higher art education. So I will talk about an outcome, or one of the immediate outcomes of this educational reform, the school that actually predates VKhUTEMAS and in fact predates also the Bauhaus, and likely influenced perhaps even the formation of the Bauhaus. The name of the school is the Free State Art Studios. So in order to educate the newly empowered masses, Soviet government dissolved the existing educational institutions. So in the case of Moscow, those are the kind of academy or the fine art college and a craft school, in this case the Stroganov Institute, and set up two sets of the Free State Art Studios, which are known as SVOMAS, sometimes also have an acronym SGHM. So this independently run assembly of art studios was founded in the fall of 1918, in October, in Moscow, as well as in other Russian cities. It was actually a national network. SVOMAS literally brought revolution to education. Its mission was to make training in the arts accessible, and I quote, to anyone willing to dedicate themselves to art. It was free for everyone who wanted to study and open to the previously underprivileged social groups. Entrance exams were abolished and the curriculum had no defined structure. In the studios, and I quote, every student was given the opportunity to develop their own individuality in any direction of their choice. In fact, SVOMAS faculty were divided into 6 groups according to the most progressive trends at the time. And this wonderful historical document from the Museum of Moscow Architectural Institute shows this. The movements included Cubism, Suprematism, and Futurism, along with Impressionism and Realism. And the document shows, in fact, how seriously the students and faculty took the goal of developing an equal representation of the different, in this case, very progressive movements that were emerging at the time. Archival documents from the same period reveal that Vasily Kandinsky, for example, who was the faculty in the Futurism section, received something like initially 4 students, but subsequent documents show that he had a group of about 50 students in the year 1918 and 1919, and then the 40 the following year. So those students studied with him for 2 years. So Kandinsky, as we know, had to abandon his life in Munich and the onset of the World War I and return to Russia, where he became actively engaged with the creation of new Soviet art and education politics and developing its conceptual structure. His role in the period between the October Revolution and when he leaves for Germany in December 1921 was absolutely crucial to the creation of Soviet art, culture, and education systems. He was someone who was instrumental in developing what I call institutionalization of the avant-garde as such. Because of his knowledge of both German and Russian culture, he also was instrumental in establishing intensive cultural exchange after World War I between the members of art section of the People's Committee on Education, Narkompros, and various leftist German organizations. In fact, the radical developments in Russia were closely observed in Germany, which in turn was going through its own revolutionary set of events. Here you can see the art program that was developed by Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was the head of the Soviet Commissariat of Education of Narkompros, as I just mentioned, in 1919, and shown here was published in one of the major German periodicals, Das Kunstblatt, in March 1919. The program called for, and I quote, the elimination of distinctions between sculptor and plasterer, painter and sign painter, the elevation of crafts to an art. And in fact, this is also quoted in one of the major scholars on the Bauhaus, Rainer Wick, in his seminal book Teaching at the Bauhaus. So this program was received with, and I quote, warmest sympathy by the founding director of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, who was also, at the time, or right before, the chairman of the Workers' Council for Art, or Art Soviet, a leftist organization of German architects, painters, sculptors, and art writers who were based in Berlin. So Kandinsky, in particular, communicated with the members of Workers' Council for the Arts, for art, and November Group. And here he quotes a letter signed by the members, of which, of course, Walter Gropius and others. Walter Gropius was the chairman. So this letter is dated from January 1919. So Gropius personally was likely familiar with the Moscow art program through the painter Ludwig Barr, a different Barr, not the Alfred Barr, a close associate of Kandinsky, who was specifically delegated by Narkompros in December 1918, so 4 months before founding of the Bauhaus, with a mission to disseminate Soviet art materials to leftist German organization. So Gropius' founding manifesto for the Bauhaus, unveiled in April 1919, so a month later, called on artists, architects, and sculptors to return to the crafts, proclaiming that there is no essential difference between the artist and the craftsman, and calling to create, and I quote, a new guild of craftsmen without class distinctions, just like the Russian art program. It became clear, and so just going back to this for a second, so here we see clearly the kind of exchange and the kind of enthusiasm that was characteristic of this very early moment in the not just the educational reform, but in setting up this very different type of school, which here I just wanted to spell out one more time. So the Free State Art Studios, which was an experiment that, while attractive in principle, it lacked any cohesiveness or synthetic unity, as Kandinsky mentioned. And in other words, it was something of a mess, something that many, including Kandinsky, lamented. And while it was perhaps the most radical educational experiment at the time, producing studios like the one you see here, the Society of Young Artists, which was a studio without a professor, and had a number of really important exhibitions. it was not really quite functioning in a kind of coherent way. On the other hand, a new Weimar Academy, as Kandinsky called it, or in other words, the Bauhaus, pursued that unity, and I quote, not merely mechanically, as in our art schools, but organically. And according to Kandinsky, at the newly formed Bauhaus, every student was obliged to study all three arts. So art or painting, sculpture, and architecture, but many others, as we'll learn as well. So after 2 chaotic years, in the fall of 1920, FOMAS was reformed into the higher art and technical studios, collectively known as VKhUTEMAS. And this time, VKhUTEMAS is following the example of the Bauhaus, which is then conceived as a unitary interdisciplinary institution. It was a school, and I quote, for advanced artistic and technical training, created to prepare highly qualified artist practitioners for the modern industry. So here you can see the kind of the very brief timeline of VKhUTEMAS, which underwent a number of reforms within its short 10 years of existence, and in 1927 was renamed into VKhUTEIN, which stands for Higher Art and Technical Institute. But for just the purposes of simplicity, we will continue to use the title VKhUTEMAS throughout the lecture. So to just clarify what the name, what the word actually stands for, it is a portmanteau, or kind of an acronym for the Russian word for Высшие художественно-технические мастерские, or High Art Technical and Technical Studios or Workshop. So VKhUTEMAS was much more than a school. It was really what I would call, quoting the constructivist architects, the educational condenser. It was a laboratory, a platform for producing, not just transferring, but producing new knowledge, and also for creating a new way of life. And even further, more of a platform for creating a new Soviet human. It was revolutionary in a number of ways, including in its acceptance and promotion of women, both students and faculty. And here we can see a wonderful kind of collage by Lysitsky, where there's literally a fusion of the two and creation of something yet new. So at the end, to complete our story with Kandinsky, at the end of 1921, Kandinsky and his wife Nina left for Germany with an official Soviet mission originally to establish a branch of the Academy of Artistic Science, Rachen. And a few months later, in the spring of 22, Kandinsky starts teaching at the Bauhaus and becomes one of its longest-serving faculty members. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the parallels and intersections between the Bauhaus and VKhUTEMAS, as I think it's really important to understand VKhUTEMAS relative to much better known Bauhaus. And we can start with looking at the two emblems that the schools developed. So one by Oskar Schlemmer, and another one by Alexander Vesnin. Here, and even on the level of an emblem, we can point to some crucial differences. For example, the Bauhaus emblem, you can recognize a profile of an individual. In the VKhUTEMAS emblem, we see the kind of outlines of the mechanical drafting instruments, so talking about sort of exactitude of mechanical production, of drafting. And I think it points to a very important difference in the sense that if that was also noted by Barr and others, that if the Bauhaus was ultimately dedicated to developing an individual, VKhUTEMAS was really about developing the masses. Both Bauhaus and VKhUTEMAS were founded in place of formerly existing schools, the Fine Arts College and the Craft School, that were fused together and created a kind of a synthetic educational model in place of something that was there already. Even the buildings were, original buildings were somewhat similar, with Weimar school originally designed by Henry van der Velde, and the Stroganov Institute's new building that was designed by Alexander Kuznetsov, who in fact was studying in Berlin and possibly knew van der Velde. So there's actually similarity in terms of the kind of large windows that both schools had, the kind of ability to have natural light in studios. And we'll see some of the interiors. But I think the bigger similarities were really in the spirit of the two schools. Open to everyone according to their abilities and aimed at forming a working community, the two schools differed significantly, however, on the matter of the community size. So the student body at VKhUTEMAS was about 10 to even 20 times larger than that of the Bauhaus. So, for example, in 1924-25 academic year, VKhUTEMAS counted about 1,445 students, while the Bauhaus had about 127 students. So we're dealing with a very different type of organization in both cases. And even though the kind of the number of graduates varies, the actual number of students matriculating at the VKhUTEMAS was quite enormous. And the same goes for the size of the faculty. So the faculty body at VKhUTEMAS was also much larger, of course, than that of the Bauhaus. As a result, it was also much more diverse and divided. So VKhUTEMAS was a more pluralist institution, which was beset by rivalry between the kind of traditionalist and futurist protagonists. So this is something that we can talk about more, but the big difference here is that with Gropius, at least during his directorship, the school was quite unified, and VKhUTEMAS was kind of a constant platform for opposition. So there was never quite a coherent sort of policy, and perhaps that was one of the challenges in really kind of writing the VKhUTEMAS history, in a sense that it wasn't always just about its avant-garde pedagogy. It was actually a combination, or always in dialogue with various other schools of thought. But I would say the chief difference, as I just mentioned, was not just the matter of enrollment or faculty size. It was, as I said, the fact that Bauhaus was about an individual, or aimed to develop an individual, whereas the Moscow workshops focused on developing the masses. And that statement by Barr has far-reaching implications. Statement by, actually, in fact, it's not quite by Barr. It's Barr mentions that in his journal, in his diary, as a conversation with David Sternberg. So the difference here is that VKhUTEMAS was really positioned to fulfill an ambitious political mandate to educate the working class masses, and therefore received a complete or total, state support in a way that the Bauhaus, of course, wasn't able to enjoy. So Bauhaus, of course, was supported by first partly the Weimar Republic, but when it moved Dessau. It was supported by the local government partly. VKhUTEMAS was more or less completely supported by the state, and therefore also its students and its faculty were completely committed in one way or the other to the mission and the philosophy of the state. The artistic training of hundreds of students, many of whom lacked basic secondary education in the case of VKhUTEMAS, was a monumental undertaking. Yet its larger significance lay in creating a new social order in which design education would serve as a key building block for fashioning the mass society. So here we see scenes from the VKhUTEMAS classroom and, of course, the Joseph Alber's famous photograph with the various paper structures. The quest for this modernist utopia was central to both Bauhaus and VKhUTEMAS. The student collective studied, worked, and coexisted in this sort of in each of these educational condensers in a way that there was really an incredible collaborative spirit, as you can see here in those photographs. So the students at the VKhUTEMAS here actually working on a project that I will show right now. It's the teapot here, designed by Zakhar Bykov and his colleagues, that I'm comparing here to Marian Brandt's famous 5-piece tea set, which is one of the most gorgeous, I would say, products produced by the Bauhaus. And I think the comparison here is interesting because if the Bauhaus tea set is about creating a separate object for a separate function, here at VKhUTEMAS the task was quite the opposite. They wanted to create one object for several functions, so to have a kind of universal thing, a universal object, which would be the teapot, will be the pot, will be the frying pan, and then everything will neatly fold into the bag so that you can carry it. And it will also occupy very little space. That same agenda also was, I would say, true for the production of, let's say, chairs. Here we can see the comparison of two chairs, one produced at the Bauhaus by, or right after the Bauhaus by Marcel Breuer, and the other is produced at Vladimir Tatlin's studio. It's a telling example of the differences between the two schools. So Tatlin's chair is made out of bent wood. It's actually a photograph of a model. And the bent wood then is tied here with the rope. And of course, the Breuer's chair is produced by using amazing high-grade steel from the, I think, made available from the Junkers factory originally at the Bauhaus Dessau. So it's not that Tatlin didn't want to use steel; that it was impossible to come by at that moment in Moscow. And I think another telling example is the chair also by Breuer, famous Vasily chair, and the other one designed by one of the Lisitsky's students. For originally the function was for the captain's boat cabin. But I think it also tells a kind of a story in terms of the very different objectives. So one chair is about, in fact, occupying as much space as comfortably possible, while the other is all about saving space, about being kind of very modest and foldable, and again multifunctional and fitting nicely within a very tiny cabin. But just to kind of go back for a second in terms of the studios, I think the notion that both schools, at least initially, had this idea of production and the crafts was important to both schools. The students could work inside the studios and produce various objects right there was key to both. So that's something that they definitely shared. I think the other important line of comparison could be made in the field of textiles. So both schools had this as their workshop, but the difference, one of the differences was that VKhUTEMAS was mass producing its students' designs in various factories, which was a very different approach at the Bauhaus. So here we have a textile weaving by Annie Albers and designed by one of the VKhUTEMAS students, which was produced at the factory, and many were actually part of the were brought into the mass production. And while there were many parallels, again, in the early history of the two institutions, there are, of course, plenty of differences as well. So on the left is the Gropius's diagram of the educational structure of the Bauhaus, produced in 1922. And on the right is a diagram that was made as a kind of, as a new diagram, reflecting the structure of VKhUTEMAS around the same time. So it's not original, but it is meant to approximate the Bauhaus one in order to create the comparison between the two schools. So both schools, as I mentioned, were interdisciplinary. The overall training included many of the same areas of specialization, so glass and clay or ceramics at VKhUTEMAS, stone or sculpture, wood, metal, weaving or textiles, and color or painting. The differences, however, were that VKhUTEMAS had an architecture and graphic design or polygraphia departments from the start, and they were envisioned at an institutional level as independent faculties. The other difference was the center of the diagram, which in the case of the Bauhaus culminated in what was called the Bau at the center of the circle, or practical building experience and experiments, design and engineering science. Yet it remained, as Gropius wrote, a distant aim, as architecture curriculum was not set up at the Bauhaus until 1927-28 with the arrival of the new director, Hannes Meyer. The ultimate, originally envisioned as a crystal symbol of new faith, and I quote, in a woodcut here by Lionel Feininger, the actual act of building was manifest at the Bauhaus in several specific structures throughout the school's existence. So here we have the Sommerfeld House and, of course, the Haus am Horn, built collaboratively by teachers and students at the Bauhaus. It culminated, of course, as a landmark of functionalist architecture, the new Bauhaus building in Dessau, designed by Gropius, and here shown at its opening day in 1925. The architecture at VKhUTEMAS had a very different fate. It was, in fact, as I mentioned, instituted as a discipline, as a curriculum from the very beginning. And perhaps the first, we can say, modern architecture curriculum was introduced at the United Left Studios, known as UBMAS, by architect and educator Nikolai Ladovsky and his colleagues Nikolai Dokuchaev and Vladimir Krinsky. UBMAS program included a sequence of exercises starting with articulation of form, I'll talk about that, followed by various permutations of form and structure, mass and weight, mass and balance, volume and space, space as such, and on horizontal and vertical rhythms. So here you can see this cutout from, or the page from the Adolf Benny's book that I showed earlier, with this exercise on space and form, which was exhibited already in, I think, 1922. This is also the wonderful photograph from the Museum of Moscow Architectural Institute. And some of the images of this very early period of architectural pedagogy from the seminal book by Lisitsky on the VKhUTEMAS architecture. So I'd like to talk a bit about the core curriculum at VKhUTEMAS and a little bit Bauhaus and point to some of the more interesting exercises. So the connection between these different departments at actually both schools was made possible by establishing a common core or preliminary or basic curriculum. At both schools, the program progressed from, so here, shown here in this kind of yellow. At both schools, the program progressed from foundational training to specialization. At VKhUTEMAS, the overall course took originally, the entire course took about 5 years, and 2 years of which were dedicated to the basic training, followed by then the 2.5 years in chosen specialization, and finally a semester for a diploma project. At the Bauhaus, the basic course, or the work course, took, according to the Gropius's plan, 1 semester, followed by 3 years of specialized instruction, and culminated in the Bau, which we just discussed. So the core course was actually developed originally was developed within the Institute of Artistic Culture in Huk, which was set up or established by Kandinsky, as I mentioned earlier, his formative role in the educational and kind of cultural systems of in the early Soviet period. He set up an institution that was dedicated, among other things, to the theorizing and analyzing various elements of arts, both the spatial and plastic arts of painting and also of music and even dance. But quite shortly after its establishment, there was a new a new group of younger members who wanted to develop a kind of a different, or who reacted to Kandinsky's approach and called it subjective, and wanted to develop their own what they called objective method, and developed working groups here of objective analysis. Those groups were divided into 4 different directions. So they were founded by architects, sculptors, constructivists, subjectivists, and two groups of painters or artists, constructivists and objectivists. And so those people and those groups started to develop this sort of elements, space, volume, graphics, and color, which in turn then transformed or were transformed by them into the foundational curriculum at VKhUTEMAS. So this was not an immediate transition. It took about 2 years, during which the course space was being developed within the architecture department, within this UBMAS studios, and the course volume was developed by the sculptors at the sculpture department. And then the course color and graphics were both being developed as part of the, or originally within the painting department, which was at the time the largest at the school. And the course color in particular underwent very interesting transformation. Originally, they were 8 different disciplines focusing on color. And among them, there was also a discipline called graphic construction on a plane that was developed by Alexander Rodchenko, that eventually became the course graphics that he taught briefly. And however, this sort of line of basic courses was almost immediately reformed again and somewhat turned back to a more traditional academic model, with the color course divided into 2 kind of branches, one dedicated to color studies, the other one to, let's say, more traditional painting type of course, and then the course graphics became more or less obsolete, and then was replaced by, again, a kind of a more traditional drawing course already in 1923. So this is important because all of those disciplines were more or less sort of tested or went through the testing period up until 1922, and then they became a part of what was called a core division, основное отделение, which is shown here, the wonderful model or a sign designed by one of the students turned teachers, Gustav Klutzes, here standing with his sign. And here he represents clearly this kind of four-part, this division, this quartet of the four disciplines. At that moment, the course or the four courses became mandatory for all the students at VKhUTEMAS. In this case, it really was a foundation for everybody who was studying at the school, and created a kind of a common ground for, again, hundreds of students. Gustav Klutzes, who, as I mentioned, was a student, later professor, devised his own method for exploring the primary and secondary color ranges based on geometric patterns, comparable to the kinds of exercises that were done at the Bauhaus at the time. Here we can see a photo from his color course. And perhaps this is one of the few courses where there kind of the theory underlying the pedagogy was already quite well established. And so it was somewhat, I would say, easier to develop this kind of scientific approach. I absolutely love this image. This is an example of one of the exercises from Klutzes' course on form and color, where he asked his students to kind of develop a relationship between the volumetric form and the various color schemes. That's also from Marhe Museum. So after this is an important photograph. It shows the exhibition of the core curriculum, and the kind of importance or the positive reaction, let's say, that Anatoly Lunacharsky, who continued to be the head of the Ministry of Education at this point, who calls the course, he writes, where the preparatory course where young people study elements of all artistic disciplines in the form of separate elements has turned out to be a firm result of our search, which began with the onset of the revolution, and that result is strong. A significant condition of this strong result was that the subject itself was deductive and stripped of historical embellishment, as these separate elements, line, color, space, volume, and so on, were a priori abstract. So this new pedagogy was not about drawing what you saw, as we have here in the kind of more traditional classroom or studio setting, but about constructing a drawing or a model using a method-based instruction. And I would argue that the core curriculum at VKhUTEMAS was one of the first ventures of its kind, or perhaps the first venture of its kind, to implement an accessible model for mass design education, or design education for the masses. It combined the emerging industrialized and long-standing academic methods to initiate this sort of new type of pedagogy, something that could be considered universal. So there are two particular courses that I'd like to kind of zoom in a bit. One is, as I mentioned, the course Space, and here we see the instructions or the assignment for one of the exercises in the course space on the vertical rhythm, and the students that produced it. And the other is the course by Alexander Rodchenko, the course Graphic Construction on a Plane, and one of his assignments with that he developed. So the two protagonists, Ladovsky and Rodchenko, shown here, in fact, worked together quite closely already during the 1919 or even a little bit before at the organization that they were founding members of, which is called Živ Skulptarh, which translates into the Commission for Synthesis of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. And this was a short-lived organization that nevertheless was incredibly important for the development of not only this new form of synthesis between the arts, but also for developing the kind of new artistic language, and in particular for, in this case, for Ladovsky, for the new language of architecture. So on the left we see a project by Ladovsky, and on the right is the experiment, the Kiosk Project by Rodchenko, who is trying himself in the kind of architectural arena here, with a wonderful inscription saying, the future is our only goal. Ladovsky at Živ Skulptarh is making his first important, I would say, postulate, one of the most important phrases that became sort of a catchphrase, which maybe I won't read the whole thing because you can probably read it, but I'll just say the one sentence, which is, the space, not stone, is the material of architecture. This was something that was written here in the bottom of this architectural presentation of a communal house that he presented at an exhibition of Živ Skulptarh in Moscow in 1920, and becomes, in a way, the kind of motto of the course space that he develops at VKhUTEMAS. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the methodology or the theory behind the Ladovsky's approach. And here there's one other character that comes into play, Lysitsky, who is a close affiliate of Ladovsky, and in fact works with him together to develop or to publish an issue of Osnova News that was published in 1926. That was the first, unfortunately, the first and only issue of this of its kind, where Ladovsky talks about or presents his theory of architectural rationalism, which he frames in terms of technical rationalism. And the difference, he says, is that technical rationality lies in the economy of labor and material, in the creation of expedient structure, while architectural rationalism lies in the economy of psychic energy, in the perception of spatial and functional aspects of a structure. So what exactly does he mean? So I think you will need to read this, but since we don't have time for that, I will try to put it in simple terms. So Ladovsky is ultimately interested in negotiating the discrepancy inherent in the translation from, let's say, two-dimensional architectural projections traditionally used by architects when designing and representing a project, and the reading of a three-dimensional spatial form. So here we can see in this image the two projections in the drawing number 1, and then in the drawing number 2 he's showing us the difference of that same object, but now in 3 dimensions in perspective, and how it's no longer the same thing. So how do we know, in fact, that this is the same object, has the same proportions and the same relationships that are obvious to us in 2 dimensions. So Ladovsky converts this idea in his exercise. In fact, the first exercise that he gives to his students at VKhUTEMAS in October 2020 is on the articulation of an architectural geometric form. He asks his students to articulate the form of a rectangular prism, pictured here, of proportions that are 1 to 1 to 1.5, in such a way that these proportions would be clearly perceived when the form is viewed in 3 dimensions. So moreover, he was interested not just in static, but also in dynamic perception. So in other words, what happens when a viewer is standing versus when she's walking or even driving. And so this is an example here of one of the exercises produced by a student of his, Viktor Petrov, which is, of course, here published in Osnova News as an example of such a kind of successful articulation of a form where one can easily identify, let's say, those proportions because of the, we read, that was his assumption, the circle inscribed in a square. And therefore, we know that the proportions are specifically 1 to 1 to 1.5. But of course, this is just the beginning of something that's becomes a much more, I would say, fascinating set of exercises and experiments in spatial form. The other aspect of his work, he's very interested in developing a kind of scientific foundation for his new method. And in 1927, Ladovsky and his former student, who became the head of the laboratory, Georgy Krutikov, and we'll hear this name one more time towards the end of the lecture, set up a so-called psychotechnical laboratory, which he was hoping to set up much earlier, but that was one way they were able to do it. And they produced a number of instruments, like the one that I'm showing here, which is called Glazameter, which is basically a plane eye meter, where one could identify which geometric figures of equal area appeared visually larger. So in this case, whether it's a square or a circle. And one of the things that they did was record these results so that a student would have in a so-called talent chart or kind of report, where a professor could track the kind of the score of the student. And that chart had actually many, I would say, or more than one purpose. So one, of course, it allowed professors to track the students. It also, I would argue, allowed one to collect or allowed them to collect the data about form and space. And this is something that becomes very important to them, perhaps even more important as the decade progresses. So here, the main task of the architectural laboratory, wrote Krutikov, and I quote, was the resolution of architectural questions based on scientifically grounded and experimentally proven premises, which would complement the existing intuitive individual approach. The major social role of architectural psychotechnics was to rise, and I quote, the mysterious veil of creativity from the work of an artist architect and to expose the laws of his working process. So in other words, they wanted to create, again, a kind of a science of architecture. And so here I'm showing on the left the instrument, which was called the space eye meter, where you could train the kind of students' ability for perception of depth, and they would have different objects that would be located in along this pivoted planes. One of the important precedents for Ladovsky was the work of Alexei Gastyev, the leader of Proletkult, the proletarian culture organization, and a revolutionary poet. Gustav had an institute which he established to develop a system of scientifically organized labor practices known as НОТ, Научная организация труда. And one of the main, which was or became one of the main pillars of Soviet centralized planning. Among the early kind of experiments that Gustav did, or his institute did, was studying the movement patterns of factory workers and trajectories of various repetitive operations, with the goal to develop training methods that would increase efficiency and anticipate the industrialization that would take over Soviet Russia from the late 20s on. So in a way, Ladovsky perhaps was trying to develop a kind of a similar level of efficiency for the young architects, where they could immediately use their own eye meter or train their own eye meter to produce kind of harmonious forms or dynamic forms. For Ladovsky, the goal of the laboratory, as I said, was twofold. So on the one hand, it aimed to test the student's ability. On the other, it sought to study spatial form as its own phenomenon. So these reciprocal research modes, what one can call objective, which investigated the phenomena of form and space, and the subjective, which tested the perception of this phenomena, relied on a kind of feedback between the scientific work conducted in the lab and also the pedagogical experiments that were produced in the studio. So in other words, the models and the exercises that the students did. This idea was finally kind of came, or this set of experiments finally came to became a textbook, which was published in 1934 by Ladovsky's former affiliates, including Krinsky, Turku Salamtsov, who developed this as a kind of, I would say, a true architectural text, and here that text is connected, as we can see through the illustrations, to both modern and historical examples. So this is quite important. They were not the only ones who were interested in, so this is the book that they published, The Elements of Architectural Spatial Composition. They were not the only ones who were interested in the ideas of formal and spatial organization. Of course, Moisei Ginsburg, who became the leader of architectural constructivism, one of the leaders of architectural constructivism, also was interested in elements of architecture. In his book Rhythm and Architecture, published in 1923, he looks at rhythm, he looks at architectural form in a kind of abstract way. I would say in some ways there are definitely some similarities between his work and the work of the rationalists. And finally, this is the last page of the Osnova News. It is interesting to interpret in this context the poetic slogan on the back of Osnova, which is a paraphrase of a famous Protagoras' claim that man is the measure of all things. And instead of this anthropocentric Greek dictum, Soviet rationalists believed that the inherent and objective value of what is in front of their eyes. They believed in the feats of modern structural engineering, here featured in the enormous crane, and in architecture as its own independent phenomenon, spatial phenomenon. So I'd like to say a few words about the course space as such, as a kind of system of exercises. And here it is important to note that it had sort of these two phases. The first phase, as I mentioned, was within the kind of its beta testing within the architecture studio, and then the second phase was as it was brought out as a part of the mandatory core training. And so the system of exercises in the first phase went from, sort of went back and forth between the abstract exercises, like shown here, let's say on form, and then immediately would be tested by the so-called production exercises. So if the abstract exercises did not have a program or site or scale, the production exercises would have a program, site, well, not necessarily site, but would have program and scale. So there was a series of let's say 6 to 7 types of exercises that students would do throughout the course. And there were several years that Ladovsky got to test this system before it became, again, as I said, open to all the students at the school, regardless of whether they would go on to become architects or not. So in this case, they have developed a program that would be much more, let's say, accessible. And so they added, in particular, exercises on surface. And then those exercises would be particularly useful to those who would study, let's say, painting, or would study various or even textiles, while the next set was frontal space, which could be even used for stage set designers, etc., etc. And then it goes into deep space, spatial form, volumetric form, and finally mass and weight. Again, this program changed throughout the years, but more or less it remained as this kind of coherent set of exercises. And then after the 1 year of abstract exercises, students would then begin to work on what was called more production exercises that were, in this case, catered to their respective specializations. So just to kind of illustrate this a bit more, here is we have the first phase exercise on, let's say, example of exercise on mass and weight, and various experiments that one of the students did, Mikhail Korzhev. And here, the same principles are then used in the production assignment, which is, in this case, was a warehouse that he is continuing to develop this as a kind of perspective set of sketches. And then it becomes an architectural project, again, using some of the same ideas of rhythm and this sort of funneling form that that was developed in the early abstract version. Furthermore, the same principles then get articulated into architecture projects, like this one, which is a restaurant on a overlooking a sea attached to a cliff, and then roughly again the same principle is being explored within a diploma project by Korzhev here, which is a stadium with suspended and cantilevered stadium seating, which interestingly enough also serves two functions. So it's both the places, the kind of where boxes where spectators could sit, but it's also a roof that protects the other spectators who are sitting in the bleachers from the elements. So again, kind of serves more than one function. And we looked briefly at their exercise on the vertical form that was explored again in two different versions. So abstract, like you see on the left, and concrete or production version, where in fact those ideas were were developed into actual skyscraper design. Again, using some of the same principles of the kind of the form that is consisting of 3 different blocks that progressively are made smaller towards the top. So that's something what is specified on the left. So the part 2 of the course focuses, as I said, and starts with focusing on the kind of 2-dimensional explorations, and then gradually moves into 3 dimensions. The first group of exercises explores this frontal surface, and then students move into the kind of frontal frontal space gradually. With the idea that, for architects, some of those frontal surface exercises would become, let's say, facade studies eventually. The frontal space would then be developed more into spatial form, such as, this is probably one of my favorite exercises from this course space, where you can see both elements of rhythm and the development of the depth of form, in this case, the cube, using the various repetitive elements and really moving in all three dimensions and three axes. The other very important topic was the exercise on mass and weight, or sometimes this particular exercise is thought of as exercise on the articulation of volumetric form. Here there's something paradoxical that I'd like to point out, which is the pedagogy of the course space to a large extent relied on making solids. And one of the few materials available in economically devastated Russia, clay, was a choice that I think in many ways was fortuitous. Its plasticity gave really an opportunity for quick experimentation and allowed the students to sort of test ideas quickly in 3 dimensions. And this is something what I would say was one of the more innovative aspects of the course space, and something that really was not done on that scale before, where architectural ideas traditionally were explored first in 2 dimensions and then brought gradually into 3 dimensions with the course space. The principal innovation was that the students would work in model first, and they would produce those experiments and those exercises responding to a specific prompt, like the one that I just showed, but there were many others like this one here. This is one of the exercises that, one of the assignments that was given, and then would develop the kind of abstract form more and more towards the more kind of, let's say in this case, architectural project, like you see here below the pavilions on that come out even. This is the page from the book that I mentioned earlier, which talks about the architecture at VKhUTEMAS, and so here they even connect the abstract models with the concrete specific exercises. So students conceived their designs in 3 dimensions from the start, as I mentioned, and I think the other important method which was used was the articulation of not just the forces of gravity like mass and weight, but was also other forces, other mechanical forces, such as in this case the force of rotation, which I think corresponds interestingly to the theory of art of spatial form that was introduced or discussed here by Lysitsky in his one of his very famous articles. So in fact, I think we can make a connection between the exercises produced in the course space and this notion of imaginary space introduced by Lysitsky. And so here again we can sort of see or follow the transformation of the abstract form into a specific architectural project, such as this pavilion. This is probably, again, one of the more interesting projects, which has, like the Guggenheim, a kind of spiral ascent here. And maybe one more project that I find, or just a quick photograph that I find particularly interesting in relationship to, for example, this one, which is a diploma, part of the diploma project by, it's an entrance pavilion to the Park of Culture, which I think has, really an interesting resonance, and also, again, something that could only be conceived in a way in 3 dimensions. So this is where you begin to see the kind of the fruits of this approach, the fruits of their labor. And maybe I'd like to complete this with 2 probably more important photographs of the classroom, where here we have a view of the space course classroom from probably around 27, where the course is really expands, and for example, in 24, the core division has about 436 students, so all of whom had to take the course. And given this curriculum of, let's say, 5 or 6 exercises, that's way over 2,000 models that are being produced in 1 semester. So in a way, you really have a kind of a laboratory of new architecture that was unprecedented, where students can build on, each other's work, because at this point, there's really very few precedents that they could look at. So the course itself and its methodology becomes a kind of innovation, and I would say one of the more fascinating things about it is, how were they able to teach something that, in a way, probably they didn't know themselves. So how do you teach something what you don't really know? I think that's a question that, the most important question, I think that VKhUTEMAS and its pedagogy was able to answer. So maybe I'll talk briefly about the other course that I mentioned, which is a course Graphics developed by Alexander Rodchenko, whose portrait you just saw. And this course is developed by Rodchenko for a core program, starting also in 1920. And it consisted of several sets of exercises that he called initiative. And here there are sort of several parameters of how the students would address this, or how the students would work. So the exercise consists basically of two parts. One is the materials that he's giving. The materials are the geometric figures, and the other is what he calls schema, or let's say trajectory scheme. That is the kind of imaginary direction along which those geometric figures would be placed. And so he's showing here the 2 examples of a successful initiative, or the successful construction. And again, this is something that's probably one of the most innovative, I would say, exercises that was developed, that really would allow for the creation of modern composition by anyone without any previous knowledge or practice at all. And so in this way, it was really revolutionary. This is some of the examples of the student work. This is by Anastasia Akhtirko, and this is from the Rodchenko and Stepanova archive. And here's the next, let's say, level of this assignment, where it goes from kind of flat elements to the 3-dimensional elements. The important thing here to note that these exercises were designed around a set of constraints using elementary geometric figures. And students were asked to perform a simple set of sequential operations, kind of initiating the composition. And Rodchenko developed several sets of, what not only what to do, but also what not to do that he describes in the exercise. So it's really kind of a complete set of instructions. Rodchenko's own experiments in abstract composition paralleled his teaching activities. So spanning a period of 5 years between 1916 and 1921, when he was teaching at VKhUTEMAS, he created a series of works that methodically explored kind of primary variables of this, let's say, new language, which became known as spatial constructions. And so, particularly, this series were based on unfolded planimetric geometric shapes, turning the 2-dimensional sheets of plywood into 3-dimensional constructions by methodically offsetting the geometry of the field. The other set of exercises known as equal form constructions become perhaps even more interesting as Rodchenko is looking for a kind of universal, let's say, universal condition that could be then used for other things, could be used actually for making things, for designing industrial objects. So he specifically says, this equal form constructions then embody the ideas of universality and serve as the kind of principles of industrial mass productions. So, and I quote, that one can build out of this identical shapes all kinds of constructions for various systems, types, and applications. And so this leads us to the next and last part of this lecture, which is about how the core exercises evolved into the prototypes for the new mass society. So how did they turn into industrial, architectural, and even urban projects? The last one of the last publications that VKhUTEMAS produced in 1929, VKhUTEMAS Futin, that shows here a chair by Lysitsky Studio and a House of Industry and Trade by one of the students of Ladovsky, demonstrates this kind of span of activity from the piece of furniture to an enormous architectural, let's say urban complex. So starting with the, let's say, industrial part, it is among the many faculty at VKhUTEMAS, they were those who we recognize today as the stars of the avant-garde. So, of course, Rodchenko, Stepanova, his wife and partner, Lysitsky and Tatlin, who all were teaching there in different periods, mainly in the metalworking and the woodworking departments. Tatlin also taught at ceramics, and Stepanova taught at textiles. So just to show you one photograph again from the Rodchenko-Stepanova archive of the furniture exhibition. This is models of furniture which illustrate, I think, quite well this principle that Rodchenko is trying to test out with his own structures, with his own work, where everything here is supposed to be, I would say, kind of as flexible and as universal as you can imagine. So the beds that fold into an armchair, the stands like this one for a book display that can be folded into the neat little box for transportation, the mattresses that fold into the wall and then out when you need them, etc., etc. So this is actually quite an incredible, I would say, collection of pieces that Rodchenko studio develops early on. We also have Lysitsky students who are working here on the so-called kitchen element, which is then further developed by the construction section for Ginsburg's Narkomfin project. And here we have, again, this idea of an element that is universal, that could be inserted as a piece of furniture into practically any interior, would be very economical, would save space, and would provide a kind of service. Lysitsky, in fact, developed a number of innovations for this is Narkomfin unit model, one of the Narkomfin unit model, where he developed several types of furniture, which in particular he outlines for built-in, transformable, combinatorial, and standardized, where each type would fit in within this unit. And that's something what then his students would develop as the course projects. So I maybe don't want to stop on this too long, but this is a very important chapter of, I would say, interior design if we were to translate it on our contemporary terms. Varvara Stepanova taught a course on composition at the textile department. Here she is shown in the dress of her own design, which she did a lot of. And here's some of her work, and then the performance that she planned. She did the costumes for at the Communist Academy, which really, I think, talks about the very new and different image of a new Soviet woman. The other professor who I wanted to point out, who I came across a bit more recently, a few years ago, at the Mayakovsky Museum, where this is his sister, Lydia Markowski. She was a textile designer and taught at VKhUTEMAS the entire 10 years. In fact, developed several super innovative techniques, specifically in aerography. This is some of her early work. This is before VKhUTEMAS, I believe. And I'm just personally fascinated by the kind of beauty of her design and the technological innovation. Here she is shown with her students at VKhUTEMAS, and some of their already projects. And as I mentioned, many of those were not only produced at a factory, but actually went into mass production. So the students were able to combine their studies with the actual practical work, which was very important for VKhUTEMAS, especially towards the end of the decade. And in fact, here I'd like to point out maybe one more important aspect of the school is the role of women. Women were not only in the textile department, were not relegated only to the textile department, as was mostly the case with the Bauhaus. They actually could be architects, they could be painters, and this was quite important for them. So the last section that I wanted to touch upon is the architecture. And as I mentioned, VKhUTEMAS was doing its best to be part of the real the building of the real world, and was really pioneering the development of the new world as such through its specifically through its architecture projects. And many of the projects were the kinds of programs that were then being built, and they were quite ambitious. So they were included, of course, the workers' clubs, the Lenin Library, the large assembly complexes such as Communist International, the houses of industry and trade, the very important program House of Congresses, the Red Stadium, which was something that was being built at the time, and of course the new city, which is probably the most ambitious program we can imagine to date. With the group of students from the Cooper Union, where I teach, we did last year a wonderful project, kind of analyzing a group of those diploma works from VKhUTEMAS that you can see here in this kind of footprint form, from the new cities that are on the right to those individual projects that I mentioned. And in fact, those became a part of the Cooper Union virtual end of the year show, and I think still you could see them on the Cooper Union School of Architecture website at the end of the year show, and we are on the in the 7th virtual floor. So some of the projects here. So I will show a couple of those, in particular the Workers' Club and the House of Industry and Trade, the House of Congresses, and a few of the new cities. So here we have a project which was quite early, actually in 1926, by Ivan Lamtsov, who develops a new housing district with this kind of new center, which is a workers' club. We he also, what's interesting, developed a kind of a new, almost a combinatoric type of housing for different, let's say, scales of different families. So from dormitory style housing to more of kind of larger apartment blocks. And another very important project that many of you know is by Ivan Leonidov, who was not a student of Ladovsky at all. He was a student of Vesnin's, but developed a project for the Lenin's Library or Lenin Institute. And then another one, which I also find very interesting, is in the same time the project by Pashkov, who also developed a library. In fact, this is actually by Vesnin's studio, not Ladovsky. So women students such as Lydia Komarova where she is developing, or this is her diploma project for Communist International, which is quite, I think, a radical project. And it's interesting in her case to see her early work as she was taking the space course with Ladovsky, and some of the same themes, again, of, let's say, even the kind of circular geometry and the rhythm that you could see in the diploma that she's doing here with Vesnin Studio. So I think it's very important to see this connection between the core pedagogy and the resulting advanced architectural projects. There is another Communist International project by Kachar, where again here we can see maybe some relation to the vertical rhythm exercises with the students sitting in the classrooms with the towers. And here is the project that we just saw here in this pamphlet, where Silchenkov is developing a kind of complex with the different, this is, I would say, an example where the function can be read quite clearly in the form, where the 8 different departments of industry are here in this kind of cylindrical towers, and then put together to create this kind of circular courtyard where people can gather. I think one of my favorite projects is the one by Rachel Smolenskaya, who is proposing this sort of tilted cube as a massive auditorium for 10,000 people, which faces the Red Square. And again, I think here we can see quite clearly the kind of, let's say, mass and weight exercises that obviously I think she went through. There are also projects that are a bit more, let's say, conservative in some ways, following some symmetrical lines, but then having very interesting moments of, let's say, cantilevering of, let's say, the whole auditorium, like in this one here. And then just a few examples of the new city, where here we have a unit or kind of an element of the new city by Lavrov, who is developing a kind of XYZ project for the House of Commune. And then this is another project, but they kind of came in parallel, where you can imagine how those could go together or form a kind of consistent new fabric for the city. Again, here we have a new city from the Kuchaev studio by Trofim Vorontsov, where there is a system of repetitive sort of towers of also different scales, and perhaps in the same vein, but yet in a different level. This is one of the first examples of maybe we can say, parametric architecture, where here Nikolai Krasilnikov is proposing a city that is actually programmable. So it's something that you could write as a kind of a code, and then before the computers, obviously, and then depending on the program, this towers could have a certain number of floors and could grow in a certain kind of parametric way. So this is the plan for that. Of course, the most visionary project that was produced was the Flying City by Georgy Krutikov, the same person who was later, or actually earlier, running the psychotechnical laboratory. And Krutikov is developing this Flying City, which to him actually is not so unreal, because it is based on a very kind of in-depth research into the new sources of energy, into the space conquest. He's in touch at this point with Tsiolkovsky, with whom they even had correspondence. So this is really something that he thinks of as possible. And the other, maybe last project that I find super interesting is the Ring City by Viktor Kalmykov, which is just a sketch here where he's proposing a kind of a ring around the planet, around the Earth, which would be urbanized. And the idea is that most of life is happening in this like Saturn in this ring, and then the industry would be on the ground, and we would need to be up. So all of those experiments, as exciting as they were, unfortunately were met with a very rigid criticism. And to the point where in 1930 the school was deemed ineffective by the Stalinist authorities and was closed, and in fact dissolved into several separate institutes. Many of them still exist today. Of course, its shutdown was part of a larger shift from the avant-garde to socialist realism, signaled by the competition of Palace of Soviets, which you see here. VKhUTEMAS' legacy was proclaimed formalist, which became really a swear word, and its archives were sequestered. So, which again explains one of the reasons why we know so little about it still to this day. So, despite its international cultural importance in the 1920s, by the mid-1930s, VKhUTEMAS was primarily perceived in light of politics and ideology, thus cutting it off from the history of modern art and architecture as told by the Western scholars such as Alfred Barr and many others. So these simultaneous forces, the attack from within, from the Stalinist authorities, and the convenient oblivion from abroad, deprived VKhUTEMAS of its well-deserved place as a major cultural center of its time. And I'd like to argue that Barr's diagram, as well as the overall historical landscape, would not be complete without the understanding of the school's seminal role in reshaping both modern design education and professional practice. And perhaps I would like to propose here, if Barr were to present a more comprehensive picture, it would look something like this, with rationalism and VKhUTEMAS occupying a prominent spot in the relationship to modern architecture and abstract art. So I would like to conclude the lecture by introducing the new book that just got published, and would like to here. And I'd like to thank, first of all, I'd like to thank the publisher, Park Books in Zurich, who worked in the most dedicated and inspired way that one could imagine. It's been a pleasure. It took us 3 years, actually, exactly, to produce this, and I'm extremely grateful to them. I'm extremely grateful to the graphic designers from Bon Bon Studio, I am also very fortunate to have incredible scholars support this study, this work, namely Kenny Frampton, who wrote the introduction, Alexander Lavrentiev, who wrote the forward, and Katerina Clark, Jean-Louis Cohen, Anthony Vidler, and Kurt Foster, who endorsed the project. So thank you to all of you. I would also like, of course, to thank the many museums and scholars and collectors and collections in Russia, namely the Museum of Moscow Architectural Institute and its incredible director, Larisa Ivanovna Ivanova-VN. I would like to thank the Shushev State Museum of Architecture and its director, Elizaveta Likhachova. I would like to thank the Mayakovsky Museum and its incredible curators, Dmitry Karpov and Julia. I would like to thank many private collections, in particular the Richard Sultan Gallery in London, Alex Lachman collection in Cologne, and also, importantly, the Beinecke Rare Book Library, where I had the pleasure of spending quite a bit of time reading and working on the amazing primary materials, many of which are translated in the book. And I hope you would have a chance to enjoy it. It's now available at Park Books and will soon be available on, I think, on all the regular websites that deal with books of this kind. So thank you so much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer those.